Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Wine Wednesdays on Viking.TV. We missed last week because it was Remembrance Day, Poppy Day in England, and the whole week was centered around that. This is the fourth in our series of Wine Wednesdays, and we love getting all the feedback from our viewers, and particularly let's see a picture of Greg and Wendy in North Carolina just sent us this picture from the day we did the Austrian wines. It's a wonderful shot. Thank you for watching us there in Asheville. And then Lynn Moeller and her Wednesday tasting crew, as she calls them, they're all ready to start tasting Madeiras. Well, I don't see the Vino Verde there. I hope you got the Vino Verde because we're going to start with that. But we will get on to the Madeira. I hope you've seen the first few episodes of Wine Wednesdays. They've been great fun. The first one was fascinating. It was Konstantin Guntram, who's been in the German wine business for hundreds of years, and he told us some fascinating stories about wartime Germany, what happened to his winery, which became the headquarters of Patton. And he told us something about his grandfather, who was actually imprisoned after a failed plot to kill Adolf Hitler. So that's an episode well worth going back to. Then we had the absolutely charming Alessandra Bindi Sagadi, who talked about her wines from Chianti Classico, and I loved the history in this and also her passion watching the great horse race in Siena, which she showed a video of them racing when her horse ran. I just wish you could have heard her screaming in the background, even though she's probably watched it about 25,000 times. And then we had, from Austria, we had these two guys, Markus Huber and Eric Mackendal. And I wanted to show this picture of the two of them for Mika in Montclair, who was thrilled to see them. She's in her 80s, and it's inspired her to go back on another cruise, hoping to see them in person. So they were a big hit with the ladies, for sure. But I'm sorry to say, this week it's just me. I'm sorry, just me. I'm talking about port and Madeira. What I'm going to do is, and also Vino Verde, I'm going to talk to you, tell you about the history of port, how it's invented, how it's made, and then do the same with Madeira. We've got lots of pictures, fun pictures to show you, which I've never shown on my seminars before. And I'm going to, before I get to port and Madeira, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. So my name is Bartholomew Broadbent, as you know, and I grew up in a wine family in England. My father is called Michael Broadbent. He died this year in March from old age, 92 years old. But he started the wine auctions for Christie's in 1966. Then he wrote for Decanter magazine for 433 consecutive months. Didn't miss a single one. In fact, when he had surgery, he was just coming up to his 400th anniversary of writing for them, and he was 3 months short. So he wrote 3 extra episodes just in case he didn't survive this heart surgery. But he made it and went on, and at 433 months, he decided just to quit, just like that. He also wrote a lot of books about wine, 2 seminal ones. One is called Wine Tasting, which was republished last year, actually, in his final year of life, when he also got remarried, aged 92, well, he was 5 days before his 92nd birthday, so technically he was 91. He married a woman in her 70s. She was very lucky. He was even luckier. And then he also wrote a book called Vintage Wine, or initially called The Great Vintage Wine Book, which was all about the wines he tasted during his time working for Christie's, the greatest wines in the world. Now, there are questions coming through, but I'm sorry if I disappoint you, but I'm going to leave those questions till the end of this, because as it's only me today, it's very difficult to focus and read questions at the same time. I'll lose my train of thought, which is tough to keep up with at the best of times. Basically, I'm in the wine business. I left England when I was, when I was 19, I went to work in Australia for a couple of wineries, but then I went back to England, worked in the wine business there. I actually worked for Hennessy Cognac as well as a tour guide. But then I went to Montreal when I was 20 to work for a wine agency in Montreal, and I was there for a year, and then they transferred me to Toronto. And in Toronto, I met a family called the Symingtons, and they recruited me after 4 years in Toronto to go and teach Americans about port and to start a company for them, which is called Premium Port Wines, and to import their wines. So for the next 10 years, from 1996 onward, 1986, I went around the States teaching Americans about port. But 2 years into that, in 1989, the Symington family bought some Madeira businesses, and we relaunched Madeira in America, which had been absent since Prohibition. And I'll get back to you later about that when we talk about Madeira. I think I have another picture. Maybe it's coming up with my mother, maybe. Is that the next picture? I think she, or maybe it's about, I know what it is. So when I moved from Toronto to, I moved to San Francisco to start this business for the Symingtons. And I was living in San Francisco for 21 years, but as things happen, I met a woman, and I thought she said virgin, but it turned out to be Virginia. So now I live in Virginia, and I got married to my wife, and we have 2 kids. So there's a picture of the wedding. And we live in Richmond, Virginia, and yeah, that's it. And my mother used to travel with my father all the time, and there's a picture of her. This is in a cellar in Paris when they discovered the 1806 Chateau Lafite. I was dragged around France by my parents. We were being used as child labor to pack up old wine cellars. You can see that my mother is dressed for the wine cellar. This is a very telling picture because I was the one taking the bottles, reading them out. My mother was writing them down. My father, in a wonderful suit, was usually sitting outside in the sunshine, taking in the rays, whilst we were doing the work downstairs. But this was a very special bottle that eventually fetched the world auction price. Back then it was $28,000, I believe. And so he was really not doing the hard work. He was, but what happened was we would pack up these cellars and transport the wine back. The very, very best bottles, like that one, the 1806 Chateau Lafite, was smuggled into England in the boot of a car, the trunk of a car, buried under all the dirty laundry, especially the children's laundry, which was sitting on top. So the customs people would open the boot to inspect. They'd see this dirty laundry, and there's no way they were going to touch it to see if there's anything hidden underneath. So that was where I brought up. Every Easter holiday we did that growing up. Now I'm going to tell you, so after working for the Symingtons for 10 years, I started my own business in 1996. It's called Broadbent Selections. It's a wine importing company in the US, and we have our also we started Broadbent, the brand, in which we make various wines. We make an Austrian Grüner Veltliner, which Marcus Huber makes for us. But we make these Portuguese wines. I know there's one question about whether the wines tasting today resemble Merlot. Well, no, they don't. But if you look at this picture, the two bottles on the right are red wines, which are made in the Douro Valley, which we make in the Douro Valley. And those are reminiscent to Merlot or Cabernet. They're sort of good, solid red wines. And the white wine there you'll see is from a region called Dow. We're not going to talk about that today, but we make white wines in Dow and we make red wines in the Douro Valley. But what we are going to talk about today is Vinho Verde. So Vinho Verde is a wine which we make in northern Portugal. I think, do we have a map of, here's a picture of a bottle of my Broadbent Vinho Verde. Actually, a fun story about this. You see that red flower? That little red flower was painted by my niece Alice when she was 4 years old. It was a Christmas card. And it was sitting on my fridge. And so about 15 or so years ago, when we started the Broadbent Vinho Verde, we were going through label designers. And I was basically going through label designers and thought, these are all boring. What we need is something fun, just like that. And I pointed to the picture on the fridge, and we used it, and it's been a huge success. And of course, now my niece is 21 years old, and she's saying, "Hey, where's my commission, whatever?" So that's a little bit annoying, but it's been a great success, this wine, and that's the rosé that you're seeing now. We make a white and a rosé, and that rosé was actually named the best rosé for spring by Cosmopolitan magazine, which we were very chuffed by. So that was good news. But what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about how Vinho Verde is made before we move on to port. So Vinho Verde is a very light, usually white wine. It's only, in our case, 9% alcohol, and it's got a little bit of a spritz to it. If you open it, it's not fizzy, it's not sparkling like champagne or anything like that, but it is a little bit spritzy, maybe the texture of, say, Coca-Cola or something like that. It's refreshing, it's just delicious. This is what we would drink in Portugal instead of Coke. It's virtually no alcohol, being 9%. In fact, I'm going to pour myself a bit, and I think you should pour a little bit for yourself at this point. But these wines are grown in sort of northern Portugal. So if you look at Europe, here are the vineyards, by the way. It's very hot in that part of the world, and so the vines, the grapes are grown fairly high up on the vines so that they don't get too warm. If they're too low to the ground, they get the heat from the earth, which so you can see the grapes are hanging up there, trailed very high. You don't usually see that sort of trellising in places like Napa Valley or anything like that, or Bordeaux. So let's taste the wine. It's got a very sort of crisp, appley nose. And it's super refreshing, super refreshing. And basically, the important thing to know about Vinho Verde is that there are two types of Vinho Verde, or it's a fairly large region north of Oporto and going along the Douro Valley. Before you get to the Douro Valley, you go along from the town of Oporto towards Spain. Before you get to the Douro region where they make port, you will go through on the train through the Vinho Verde region. But it's a large region, and they make all sorts of wines in the Vinho Verde region. But to be a Vinho Verde per se, there are four things which are traditional. One is that it doesn't usually have the vintage date on it, because what we do with this wine is we want it to taste the same every time you drink it. So it's all about blending, kind of like champagne. Non-vintage champagne is all about the skill of blending, so that each time you taste it, it's going to be consistent and taste the same. So you can't have a vintage date because you tend to rely on more than one vintage perhaps to make a Vino Verde. Also, we never put the grape varieties on it. Also, it's under 9%, technically under 11% alcohol, unless there's one small region where it can be 12% or under, but the rest of the region it has to be under 11%. And we put a little bit of CO2 into it when we bottle it. We keep it in these big stainless steel tanks until we bottle it for shipment, so it's really, really fresh. Put a little bit of CO2, gives it that little bit of spritz, and that's what makes it so delicious. Now, if you buy a wine from the Vino Verde region, and Vino Verde is also reasonably priced. This is under $10 or under £10, wherever you're watching. So if you're buying a wine from the Vino Verde region and it's a regular 14% alcohol or something like that, or 12.5% alcohol, or if it has a vintage date and grape varieties on it, then you know it's probably not a Vino Verde. It's kind of like saying not all brandy is cognac, but all cognac is brandy. So all Vino Verde is Vino Verde, but not all wines from the Vino Verde region are Vino Verde. A little bit complicated. I hope that makes sense, but it's fun. Anyway, now here's the map I was hoping to show you. It's actually entitled Portugal's River of Gold. And apparently there are lots of cruise lines. Well, Viking cruise goes down this route, and there are lots of historic reasons that they called it the River of Gold, but I call it the River of Gold because of a gentleman called the Baron de Forester, who was the first person to demarcate the region. And he was traveling with a woman called Donna Adelaide de Ferreira, and they were going up the river. He had his boots filled with gold, big boots, filled with gold to pay the grape pickers or the vineyard owners. And she was wearing a beautiful crinoline dress, and unfortunately the boat capsized. He sank to the bottom, weighted down by this gold. His body was never found. And she, because she was wearing this big crinoline dress, just floated to the side. Even though she couldn't swim, she just floated to the side and got out. So there is gold buried in the Douro River somewhere right now. It's never been discovered. So I'm going to tell you now about port, and then we'll get on to Madeira. So port was basically invented when the French were at war with the British, which I assume was that way around. I can't imagine the British being at war with anyone. But anyway, the French were at war with the British. They must have declared war against us, I assume. But we had to stop buying wines from Bordeaux. So basically what we had to do is to find equivalent quality and style wines to the wines of Bordeaux. And along the Douro River, from the town of Oporto, from which port gets its name, along the Douro River, close to the Spanish border, they made very similar wines to Bordeaux, and they were similar quality, similar style. But the trouble is the long sea journey from Portugal to England with primitive shipping methods, primitive winemaking methods. Basically, the wine was no good. It wasn't stabilized enough to survive the long sea journey. So what they had to do was to add brandy to the wine to fortify it. So it's a fortified wine. What we do is we add brandy to the wine to give it strength for that sea journey. Obviously, we don't need to do that long sea journey under such primitive conditions these days, but we still add brandy to the wine because that's what port is. It's a mixture of brandy and wine. About 1/5 of a bottle of port is made out of brandy. The brandy is distilled table wine It has no color, no flavor, and no aroma. It's just a fortifying agent. And that's how we make port. So when wine reaches about 7% alcohol during fermentation, when there's still a lot of sugar that hasn't yet been converted into alcohol through fermentation, what we do is we add the brandy to the wine. This kills the yeast, so the fermentation stops. The wine is now at this point about 19 or 20% alcohol, and the fermentation stops, and what you have left is a naturally sweet wine during fermentation. Now, I'm just going to say to you now, whilst I'm talking, enjoy this wine. Drink the whole bottle, because what else are you going to do? And it's really, it's very difficult to get drunk on that wine. Just to give you an idea of the importance of alcohol, let's say you drank a bottle of 15% alcohol wine, and I drank a bottle of wine that's 12.5% alcohol, an entire bottle each. The difference in alcohol intake that you had over me is equivalent to nearly 3 vodka tonics. So would you drink a bottle of wine that's 12.5% alcohol and then ask your friends for 3 vodka tonics? They'd look at you, they'd think you're nuts, and they would seriously be concerned about you. But that's actually what happened if you drank the 15.5% alcohol wine, 15% alcohol wine. Or put it this way, if you're drinking and driving, 2 4-ounce glasses of 12% alcohol wine in most places, not all, so check your laws, most places you're under the drink drive limit, whereas 2 glasses of wine at 14.5% alcohol, you are over the drink drive limit. And this has been a big problem for port, because over the years, I started selling port in America in the mid-1980s, and it grew and grew and grew. But in the 1990s, the alcohol levels of table wines from California and other countries started to grow as well. So whereas most wines used to be about 12% alcohol, 12.5% alcohol, now you're getting wines 14, 15% alcohol. And the problem is, if you're sitting down to dinner, sharing a bottle of wine with someone, if you're drinking a bottle that's 12.5% alcohol, you can share a bottle and even want something else, so you have a glass of port. But if you are drinking a wine that's 14.5, 15% alcohol, you get 2/3 of the way down, you're both completely drunk by then, or you're drunk enough so that you can't drive, and you may not want anything else, but if you do, you just finish the bottle. So port sales have suffered due to the fact that alcohol levels have risen. But there's a great reversal of interest towards lower alcohol wines, and the fact that Vino Verde is only 9% alcohol, I mean, frankly, I can drink a bottle of that and not feel, I mean, it's like having a couple of beers, you don't really feel it at all. Anyway, so enjoy this whilst we're talking about port. So let's see if we have another picture. Yes, we do, thank you. This is actually the town of Oporto, where port gets its name. At the end of today's session, I'm going to show a video which has a beautiful scene of Oporto. But this is the traditional boats. I told you that the Baron de Forester fell off his boat when it capsized. This is what it would be on, one of these boats. And actually, every year, I think it's in July, they have a regatta where they have a race between all the port companies. And this year I was on Ferreira's boat, Barca, they're called Barca, and we raced against all the others, and I don't know if anyone really understands who won or not. It's just such a good laugh, and we're all drinking lots of port and having fun. But someone must have won, but it wasn't us. But that's the old method, how they used to transport wine down from Madeira Valley to the town of Porto. And in the town of Oporto, that's where they have a place called Vina Nova de Gaia, where they age the wines and they start resting. So someone very frequently asks me, people ask me, what's the difference between port, sherry, and Madeira? Now, port, they're all fortified wines. So port is a wine which you add brandy to it, you make it, it's Portuguese, and then you age it either in oak barrels, or you bottle it at 2 years old or 4 years old, and you age it in bottles. So these are the sort of barrels that you would age port in. They're called pipes. A pipe of port is bigger than your French barrique that you'll see in most wineries. It's quite a bit bigger. And they're grown, the vines are grown on these terraced vineyards, which are stunningly beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful region. All manual labor, you can't really machine harvest those. There are, well, when I started, here's Beauty and the Beast, that's me in the swimming pool at Quinta de Crasso, one of the most stunningly beautiful swimming pools in the world, overlooking the Douro Valley beneath. But basically, the grapes are picked, they're fermented, and they're sent down aged. And the wines are aged in different ways. That 2 years of age, which is a vintage port, late bottle vintage is 4 years of age. Reserve wines are between 4 and 6 years of age, and then we have the tawny ports, and we'll get on to that in just a second. But basically, this is, that's the vineyards of Quinta de Crasso. I put these pictures up. I used to represent that winery. They're a super family and one of the most stunningly beautiful, picturesque wineries in the Douro Valley. They say that the Douro is the most beautiful wine producing region in the world. The South Africans argue that the Cape is, but also the Madeirans can claim, and we'll see pictures from Madeira later, but Madeira is stunningly beautiful too. So basically, port was invented through shipping to the English when the French were at war with the British. They then basically stopped making table wines because they were exclusively making port. And now, since really about the 1990s, they've been making great wines again. And so they're great, great producers of table wine in Portugal. Let's see the next picture just to, so it is a stunning, this is a classic port Quinta. It's actually where Donna Antonia Adelaide de Ferreira lived, the woman who floated in her crinoline dresses. That's my son in front of it. So that's a classic Quinta. The Quintas, the farms which make port are called Quintas. In France, in Bordeaux, they're called chateaux, but in Portugal, it's called a Quinta. And this is me and my son. He's now 15, so that was a few years ago. We're having lunch at Quinta de Crasso, and that was quite a memorable trip because I almost lost my life driving a four-wheeler vehicle off a cliff, but luckily I landed in a tree and didn't have too much damage, but it was bad enough that my son was very upset. Anyway, let's move on to the next picture. I just want to see what we've got next. Oh, yeah, so it's a beautifully scenic river. I think that's a Viking ship. It goes from Oporto up the Douro. Eventually at the Spanish border, the river turns into the Spanish name of the river, Ribeira del Douro. But there's a wine region called Ribeira del Douro, but that's way further up on the same river, but miles away. That's a wonderful picture. Lucky people on that cruise ship. Hopefully people will be cruising again soon. So let's just look at the next picture because yeah. So there are different types of port. When I started selling port in 1986, there were 28 known varieties to make port. 6 of them were white and the rest were red. And they had names like this, and I'll stop, I won't go on too long. Touriga Nacional, Touriga Francesca, Tinta Cao, Tinta Roriz, Tinta Amarela, and Tinta Barroca. after 6, I see people's eyes glazing over, so I stop. But basically, they are all indigenous grapes. But Jancis Robinson, who's a great English wine writer, started studying grapes and writing a book about grapes. And the advent of DNA technology, they've been discovering more and more varieties, and they now have about 200 varieties of indigenous grapes in the Douro region. So some of the really great table wines and ports may be a blend of 70 different varieties in field blends. So there are a lot of more white grapes, more than just 6 white varieties, and the port bottle we showed you before was a white port. So white port is made in the same way as red port, except that it has it's made out of white grapes instead of red, and it can age nicely. But the way I drink white port is I like to have it what's called a portonic, which is to pour a white port over on the rocks with a twist of lime or a twist of lemon put into it, and then some tonic water, maybe 1/3 white port and then 2/3 tonic water. But you can play around with the blend. It's a really refreshing drink. When people go to Portugal, they discover it, they love it, they all come back wanting to drink white port, but once they're back here, they can't find it very easily. But it is possible. If you go to winesearcher.com and look for the Broadbent white port, you might be able to find it somewhere and have it shipped to you. The next type of port is, this is a reserve. Now, my reserve is called Auction Reserve in honor of my father's auction career, but also as a symbolism of one of our highest quality ports. But basically, you bottle ports at different stages, either 2 years of age, 4 years of age, 7 years of age, 10 years of age, 20, 30, 40. Reserves are blends, and they're blends of wines somewhere between 3 and, say, 6 years of age. And they are basically meant to show the house style of the port house. So wines which you may have heard of are Graham's 6 Rates, Fonseca's Spin 27, War's Warrior, Taylor's First Mistake, Taylor's First Estate, and things like that. These are called reserve ports. Ours is the Broadbent Auction Reserve. So it's a blend of different wines to give you an idea of what our port style is. The very, very best ports are aged Tawneys or vintage. Vintage is bottled when it's 2 years of age, when it's very young, and designed to age for a long time in the barrel, in the bottle. Whereas the other best wines, what the Portuguese consider to be the top wines, are Tawny ports, and they are bottled at 10, 20, or 30 years of age. And these are blends of wines averaging 10, 20, or 30 years of age. When you get to the Madeira section of this talk, you'll see that Madeira, if you have a 10-year-old Madeira, it's a minimum of 10 years of age, whereas this is an average of 10 years of age for port. And ports tend to be the difference between a vintage port, for instance. Vintage port is you're capturing the fruit by bottling it young, whereas Tawny port, you're aging it so they become very different. They become woody, nutty, vanilla, and really, I know that there's a question. I was looking at some advanced questions that came through earlier, and one of the questions was what to drink with Thanksgiving desserts, and I believe it was Richard from the United States who wanted to have wine with turkey for Thanksgiving. Well, I would do maybe even the Vino Verde with turkey, but with the desserts, Thanksgiving desserts, I would tend to do Tawny ports. They tend to be the better blends. I think we've really covered most of the port history. I will go back to questions later on, but here we're now showing you a map because we're going to move on to Madeira. And I was explaining what's the difference between port, sherry, and Madeira. Port being aged in bottle or in barrel and comes from Portugal. Sherry comes from Spain, and that is a fortified wine that's aged on a yeast, and the yeast, which we call flor, gives it a very particular tang, which is very appealing to some. And then Madeira is Portuguese, just like port, but it's made on an island called Madeira. The word Madeira in Portuguese means woods, because this wine is on an island which, when it was discovered, was covered in woods. And they actually wanted to cut down some trees to make a settlement on the island, this volcanic island. But instead of cutting them down, they decided to set fire to them. It would be quicker. And the fire burnt just about every single tree on the island, and it lasted for 7 years, the fire. And meanwhile, enriched the soil, of course. But Madeira as a wine, compared to port and sherry, Madeira is a wine which we cook, we heat it. We heat it to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 55 Celsius, for a minimum of 3 months. And this is to replicate the voyage between America and Europe, because Madeira, as you saw from that map, is an island. It's actually off the coast of Morocco, off northern Africa, about 400 miles off the coast of Morocco, directly in the trade winds between Europe and America. And all the boats used to stop off in Madeira to pick up provisions and other things, and they used to use the barrels of Madeira as ballast in the bottom of the boats. And one day, one of these boats arrived in Savannah or wherever it was going. They forgot to unload the cargo of Madeira, and it returned to the island, and they tasted the wine, and they found it was much better than before it left. And so they figured, having crossed the oceans twice, had heated the wine and changed it. And so for many years, there was a law that you could not sell any Madeira until it had been shipped around the world twice. Now that's slightly impractical these days, but we still simulate that voyage by cooking the wine to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 55 Celsius, and that's what creates Madeira. Whether it's a white wine or a red wine, that is what creates Madeira. It's that heating process. It's a stunning island. Let me just see the next picture to see what I can tell you about that. Ah, yes, of course. So it was invented through shipping to America. Actually, Madeira is the most American wine you will ever come across. It was the biggest selling wine in America until Prohibition. It was so big that George Washington drank a pint of Madeira every day for dinner. Betsy Ross, when she was sewing the flag, she had a little side table with Madeira on it. This is a picture from the Declaration of Independence. Both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were both toasted with Madeira. And actually, we borrowed this picture from Alessandra Bindi Sagadi, who was in our second show. And between the men standing and the man sitting, you can see 4 people seated in the background, and one of them is an ancestor of Alessandra Bindi Sagadi, and shows in her story. So it was such a big selling wine in America. It was even your first tax loophole. That's because King James I, whoever it was, said taxation without representation. Basically said, drew a huge circle around Europe and said everything that comes from here going to America has to be taxed. And being not the brightest of them all, he forgot that this little island off the coast of Morocco belonged to Europe. It belonged to Portuguese, but it wasn't in that circle, so it became a tax loophole. And in fact, after the Declaration of Independence, the very first place to recognize their independence was Madeira. The Portuguese say Portugal was, but specifically it was Madeira who were the first people to acknowledge and recognize America's independence. And they're very proud of that history between the states and the island of Madeira. So you might think, why do we not know this? Because it's actually such an important part of your history that it should be in every single history book that's published. And if you read any biographies of any of the great statesmen from the colonial days, Madeira features all over throughout the books. But I was told once by a school teacher who attended one of my seminars about 3 or 4 years ago, she said that unfortunately all references to alcohol are removed from children's school textbooks. So basically you never learned this about Madeira. Though then, unfortunately, the two things that killed Madeira pretty badly. One is a little bug called phylloxera. Now, phylloxera is a little bug that exists in the States, and it moved to Europe and killed every vine in Europe except for a few vines which were grown in sandy soils where the bug doesn't exist. But it was a bug which came and killed all the European vines. And the cure came from America as well. They actually found that if you grafted vines onto American rootstock, it was resistant to this. So having had every vine destroyed by phylloxera coming from America in Madeira and most of Europe, they now graft all the vines in Europe almost are grafted onto American rootstock. But what was worse than that was prohibition, because 95% of Madeira was sold in America, 5% went to Russia and England. And I love this picture. Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours. Well, to be honest, it wouldn't take prohibition for me to honor that request. But basically, prohibition overnight, you imagine that if 95% of your business went away, you would give up, you'd start doing something else. So at that point, Madeira ripped out most of their vines, they planted other crops. Bananas became a big crop, orchids today are a big crop. But there are still about 1,500 growers on the island. There are only about 7 companies that make Madeira, and we buy from about half of them. But they live on these tiny little pieces of land, and on their land they may have a few vines, but they'll also have other crops that they survive off, and then they'll come along to us. Shippers, and we will bottle wines and age them, and we'll also help them maintain the vines in their properties. So only about 7 producers, about 1,500 growers, and some people might just bring in 1 bucket of vines, others substantially more, but not huge amounts, because Madeira is a very small production, whereas in port there are at least 3 shippers who make well over 1 million cases of port each per year, whereas the total production of all Madeira made for consumption is about 100,000 cases between all 7 of us producers. Let's see the next picture. Oh, so yes, so my history with Madeira. So that's me and my son. This was a picture of me in a cape and hat, and I'd just been enthroned in the confraria, the Brotherhood of Madeiras. And this just reminded me, I do regret that I meant to wear my wonderful Madeira hat at the beginning of the show, so I'll put it on now for a few minutes. I really wanted to have that when I started the show today, but it wasn't about Madeira in the beginning, so now it is. It's a wonderful Madeira hat. Anyway, so I moved to the States to teach Americans about port in 1986, and for 10 years I was going to be just doing ports. But then in about 1988, the family I was working for said, "Do you think you could sell Madeira in the States?" And I said, "Well, yeah, it's such a historic wine to America. Of course I could." And so they actually invested in some Madeira companies. They bought some Madeira companies, and we relaunched Madeira because it had been killed during Prohibition, basically gone away. And after Prohibition was repealed and the Second World War had improved shipping, there was no longer any need for these ships to stop in Madeira to get provisions. They could just sail straight through to the United States, so they didn't need to. So Madeira really never recovered. There was a guy called Darrell Corti. There's a guy called Darrell Corti who was bringing in some brand called Abudrum for his Corti brothers in Sacramento. But apart from him, there was no Madeira in the States. There was basically Burns Steakhouse. They bought some old wines at auction, so they had some old vintages of Madeira. But the only restaurant in America that I knew of when I started selling Madeira again in 1989, relaunching it in the United States, the only restaurant that had it was Massa's in San Francisco. And they gave you a choice of Chateau Yquem or old vintage Madeira to go with the foie gras. Apart from that, I didn't know any other restaurants in the country who served Madeira. So we did this tasting at the Four Seasons Clipped in San Francisco. We served about 19 Madeiras going back to 1845. Well over 300 people came to this tasting, all from the restaurant business and wine trade in San Francisco. And it really relaunched Madeira because the next week, there's a restaurant in St. Helena, Napa Valley called Treviña, which had 7 Madeiras by the glass. And every single A, B, and C level restaurant in San Francisco had Madeiras the following week. And that was the rebirth of Madeira in America. And now it's next. From 1989 onwards, I was promoting both port and Madeira, and then started my own company in 1996. I ended my career with the Symingtons. I guess I hadn't married one of their daughters, so I didn't have a future in that business. So I left them and started Broadbent Selections. But my main goal was to start Broadbent Madeira. I actually sent my parents over to the island in 1996 to help come up with the blends of Madeira for my brand, and also to buy some older barrels for us to bottle under the Broadbent brand. In fact, my mother's tasting notes were spectacularly good. She wrote to me saying, "This one's a deathbed razor." And I said, "Well, what's a deathbed razor?" And she said, "Well, if I was on my deathbed and someone gave me this wine, I'd just get up and I'd be fine. I'd be, the acidity level would just get me going." Unfortunately, she died 5 years ago. I didn't have a bottle to test the theory, so I couldn't really prove if that would actually work. But she had a funny sense of humor. She would love the fact that I'm telling stories about her now. Anyway, so we started making these wines, and let me just see what the next picture is, just to see what. Oh, yeah, so the vineyards are, again, they're kind of like Vino Verde, but not what you imagine as vineyards. You imagine Napa Valley and Bordeaux and other places around the world where they're just trails of rows of vines. In Vino Verde, you saw that they were grown high up on the trellis, high up off the ground. Well, in Madeira, they are also grown high up. You can see they're way above I'm 6 foot tall, 5'11.5" or whatever I am, and the vines are higher than me, so they have to pick up here instead of bending over, breaking your back, picking down there. And here we are. This is actually very, very typical. This is actually the bottom of the cliff right next to the sea. And the next picture, I think, will show you another place. They just find, wherever they can find space to grow vines, they will grow vines. This is on a cliff. Madeira is a dramatically beautiful mountainous volcanic island. It's basically, think of a Hawaiian island. It's about the size of Hawaiian island. And it's made in the same way. We pick the grapes and we ferment them, and we then put the alcohol in them to raise the alcohol level, to fortify them. So from, instead of being 7% alcohol, you add the alcohol, it raises it up to 19%. And that, again, just like port, kills the yeast, fermentation stops, and what you have left is a wine with natural sweetness, residual sugar, naturally sweet from the grapes. We don't add any sugar, it's always naturally sweet. And the hallmark of great Madeira is the acidity. The acidity is really crucial. The next picture, which you saw very briefly, is the barrels, because once we've added the brandy, we then heat the wines for the 3 months at 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and then we transfer them into barrels. You can see in front of these three people, there's a very old, big barrel, and behind them are other barrels which are slightly newer, maybe the size of regular barriques that you'll find in regular wineries in the States and Europe. But they also have very large barrels, but the wines are aged in oak at this point for either 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, or even 20 years more. And so this is Juan Teixeira, my winemaker, standing in front of one of the larger old oak barrels. They're all very old oak. Sometimes we get, and that's my son sitting on a bunch of barrels. I always wonder if they're going to fall over, roll out on top of him and crush him, but no, they're all wedged in, they won't do that. But so the wines are aged for a very long time. With a vintage port, I mentioned that for a vintage port, it had to be 2 years of age when it's bottled, and then it ages gracefully in a bottle. Well, for a vintage Madeira, it has to be actually 20 years of age before it can be bottled or sold. So vintage Madeira is very, very expensive to make, and it ages in those barrels. What's the next picture we have that we can show you? Oh, okay, so we're going to talk about the styles of Madeira. Actually, this is a lovely picture of Karen McNeil. Any of you who are big wine buffs might have read her book. She's got a book called The Wine Bible, which is a fabulous book and one of the biggest selling wine books in the world, actually. But she was recently tasting my Madeiras. So the different styles of Madeira we have are rainwater, which is bottled at 3 years old, and that's a lighter style of Madeira, and that's what we're going to taste today. That's rainwater, then we bottle the wines at 5 years of age, then we bottle them at 10 years of age, and then really 20 years of age. But there are some exceptions. There's a type of wine called a colheita, and a colheita is a vintage Madeira that hasn't waited till it's 20 years old, so we don't refer to it as vintage, but it's a younger vintage dated wine. We call it colheita. The Portuguese word for vintage is colheita, so it makes sense to call that colheita. And we've been bottling colheita since 1995, and what we did, we went to the government to petition them. We said it's really unfair. The port shippers can bottle their vintage ports at 2 years of age, and so it's not a very expensive wine to sell, and they mark it up a lot and sell it for expensive prices. But we have to wait 20 years, and it's really expensive to make, and we have to sell it for even more than the vintage ports, and we don't make as much money. So we wanted to make a younger vintage dated Madeira, and they agreed that we could sell them as colheiters. So that was in 2000 that they agreed that, and we bottled our first one was with the 1995 vintage. We were the first ones to do that. The other thing that we are actually pioneering is we are the first ones to sell single cask Madeiras, first ones to bottle single cask Madeiras. So these are actually vintage Madeiras. I have a bottle here. It comes out of it comes in that lovely wooden box that you see, and we have vintage Madeiras. You can see this one is a Boal. So the grape varieties in Madeira, there are basically three red ones. There's Triunfo, Complexa, and Tinta Negra. Tinta Negra being a very important one. And then white grape varieties are Cercial, Verdelho, Boal, Malmsey, Tarantes, and then very, very, if not even really made much now, is Moscatel and Bastardo. And Tarantes is so scarce. You know, one year we only made 28 cases on the entire island. A good year might be about 300 cases, but so that's really not very well produced. But the Cercial, Verdelho, Boal, and Malmsey are all names of grapes, but they are also these styles. So if you go into a bar in Madeira and say, I want a Cercial Madeira, they will give you a dry Madeira, because Cercial is always dry, and it's grown usually higher up in the mountains where it's a little bit less ripe, and they're leaner wines. Whereas then the next driest is Verdelho, and then the Boal, which is the one I have here, is medium sweet, and then the sweet one is Malmsey. Now, when do you drink Madeira? Well, pretty much any time. Dean Medeiros wanted me to say in his comment, wants me to say that any time not drinking port is time wasted, but in fact, I say that about Madeira too. But Madeira is there's such a variety of wines in Madeira that you could actually drink it throughout the meal. And of course, when George Washington was drinking a pint of Madeira every day for dinner, he was not drinking it as a dessert. He was drinking it throughout the meal. So you have the Cercials, which are delicious before dinner with nuts, with cheese. Cheeses before dinner, it's delicious. Then you have Verdelhos, which I think are fantastic with soups. They have a very, very high acidity, so they're the only wine that can go with salads. Then you have Boals, and I would challenge you, you could put a Boal with a steak, because the fattiness of a steak matches so well with the acidity of Madeira that it actually really goes well. But most Madeira is drunk as a dessert wine. And the great thing about Madeira is that it has a very high acidity, so it can go with even citrus desserts. I mean, sometimes when I'm doing seminars, I'll say to the chef, bring out a dish of balsamic vinegar and a piece of bread, and we'll have people dunk the wine into the bread and taste it. Not even dunk the wine into the vinegar and then eat that and then have some Madeira, and that doesn't even kill the Madeira. The acidity of vinegar doesn't even kill Madeira. And then also, even though it's got a dry finish, it has, even if it's a sweet Madeira, it has a dry finish. So if you were to put a dessert wine with dessert, let's say you chose a Sauterne or a late harvest wine or a Trockenbeerenauslese from Germany or something like that, if you use dessert wines and you put them with dessert, the sweetness of the dessert clashes with the sweetness of wine and basically kills the wine. But because it makes the wine taste dry, but because Madeira already has that dry finish, you can have Madeira with dessert and it doesn't kill the dessert. Now, also cooking with Madeira is very important. a lot of recipes call for Madeira, and I am cooking with Madeira a lot of the time. I even put it into the food sometimes, but usually I'm drinking it. But if you do use Madeira to cook with, it's very important to make sure you use a true Madeira, not a domestic Madeira that's calling itself Madeira, because those are not made the way that Madeira is made. The key to Madeira and cooking Madeira is the fact that Madeira has already been cooked. You can do the worst, the worst thing you can do to any wine is to heat it, but that's what creates Madeira. So when you cook with Madeira, you don't lose the flavor. Now you might say, well, okay, it's more expensive than that domestic stuff we use. Yeah, but you'll keep adding the domestic wine into the dish because every time you do that, the flavor burns off, so you have to have more. But with a true Madeira, you might use a tablespoon as flavoring versus a cup of the other stuff. So it's actually cheaper to use the better stuff. And you wouldn't use a Madeira, you wouldn't use wilted lettuce or poor quality ingredients for anything else, any other part of your dish. So why would you use cheap wine to cook with? Use what you're willing to drink to cook with. And then that's the rule for cooking with wine. Always use something that you're willing to drink and don't compromise on that. Let's see your next picture, because I think we've got lots of lovely pictures of Madeira. Oh, well, let's taste one whilst we're doing that. I imagine you've all probably finished your Vino Verde by now. But we're going to taste the rainwater. Rainwater, as I mentioned earlier, is a lighter style of Madeira. No one really knows why it was called Madeira. Rainwater. One theory is it was a gentleman in Savannah who said this wine is as fine as rainwater, obviously before Industrial Revolution rainwater. But that's one theory how rainwater got its name. And then another theory is that they left some barrels out in the tropical storm, and they got diluted, but we don't know for sure. But it is a lighter style Madeira. It's got a lighter color, and it's a lighter style. But it's a delicious, it's kind of like a cross between dates and raisins and nuts and cheese rind and lots of citrus characteristics, like orange peel and rose water, and lots of floral characters as well. Delicious. So I hope you enjoy this rainwater Madeira. Meanwhile, I'm going to tell you a bit more about the island, because when people say to me, oh, we want to go to see the wineries in Madeira, I say, well, look, okay, if you're going to Madeira, let's say you're on a cruise, don't go and see a winery. Just take a tour of the island, because it is so stunningly beautiful. If you want to go and see wineries on Madeira, go for 5 days and spend half a morning seeing a winery, and then you've done it. But there's so much more to see. This is actually one of the few places it's outside Cama de Lobos where you actually see vines. You see that canopy of green sloping down. Those are basically they're either bananas or vines, but there are very few. There's only one vineyard in Madeira. Most of them, I'll come to this picture in a minute. Most of the vineyards are they're very small plots of land where they grow lots of different things. But there's only one. I think Henriques owns a single vineyard that's just vines, nothing else. But basically, that's about it. You don't go and see lots of vineyards. You see lots of vines growing in people's backyards, and that is actually what we produce Madeira from. So let's go on to the next picture, which is fascinating. I actually wrote to the Guinness Book of Records about this because I looked up the highest viewing platform in the world, and they have it overlooking the Grand Canyon. Well, I looked up at the height of that and then wrote to them about this, because this is 3 times higher. This is a glass viewing platform, not for the faint of heart, by the way, but that's me standing on glass above a cliff, and you're looking down. You're at the height of a vineyard, height of an aeroplane, and it's incredible to see. But it has the second highest cliff in the world, and then probably lots of other cliffs which are close in height to that as well, all around the island. You can see this. This is a fascinating picture. Just go back to that one. This is the top of I'm looking over a railing down at some vineyards in the bottom, and there's a little restaurant in there, and the only way to get there is by boat or by that cable car that you see on the left. And it's quite hairy because it's really, really, really steep. So if you're used to going on cable cars to ski lifts, you might be used to it, but this is much steeper than incline than those because it's really a complete vertical drop. So and the next picture I think is, well, that's me standing underneath, but that's again looking down on that same little plot of land where that is actually all that belongs to one person, all those buildings he makes. Now, when Madeira joined the European Union, or Portugal joined the EU, the World Bank sent tons and tons of money, and that money was used to build roads. And the picture you're about to see is what the old roads looked like. You'd have to go all the way around the island to get around the island, and on these little roads which are basically hugging the cliffs. So on the right of that is the sea, and on the left is a cliff that goes maybe up 6,000 feet. It's massive. So now what you see there is one of the new roads. I'm taking that picture from the old road. That's a new road that goes, they just built tunnels. It's hundreds of tunnels in Madeira. And so what now takes maybe 45 minutes to get from one side of the island to the other, it took almost all day to do by car before, when I first went there, well, in the 80s and even in the 90s, it would have to be an all-day trip to go around the island. But now you can cut across it in half an hour and go back. It's amazing. But these old roads are really fun to explore. They actually put chains across them. So for me to get this picture, I had to undo the chain and drive through. They're a little bit concerned because some of the roads are crumbling and there's a danger of rocks falling off. But they are stunningly beautiful. And if you don't want to drive, you can hike them. But you just got to watch out for falling stones. But this one, you can see there's a waterfall landing in the road. And the next picture, I think, if it's what I think it is. Yes, so there's a really funny story about this. I was in Madeira with two colleagues, a customer and a guy who worked for me. And we stopped the car and they sat in the car. And I got out because I wanted to take a picture of the car with the tunnel behind. And what I didn't realize is there would be a massive wave. So this massive wave came along, hit the car and moved the car to the other side of the road. And I came back and they were laughing hysterically. And I thought this must be a reaction to being so scared or something, because it was quite a hairy moment. But the reason they were laughing is because they had closed their windows. They were on the side of the wave. And my window was actually open. And what they were laughing at was the fact that the water had come in from the other side and my seat was completely flooded. And so I had to drive the rest of the day with a wet bottom. But that's really quite dramatic to see that wave I wasn't expecting it, which is quite fun, but it was a moment, you know. Let's see what's next. Oh, so what we did was we drove around the island, and then we drove over the top of it. And this is on the top of the island. We're above the clouds at this point, which is just goes to show that one moment you could be in the winter, you could be skiing or you could be in snow at the top, and then you could be swimming in swimming pools at the bottom. Madeira is not an island with beaches. It's a volcanic island, so it's black rocks. So you don't go there for beach holidays. You do go there for beautiful hotels. The next couple of pictures are a place called Valley of the Nuns. And the Valley of the Nuns is a really interesting place because until about 15 years ago, when they built these tunnels, 10 years ago, when they built these tunnels, to get to a place like that, you had to walk. You couldn't drive a car. You had to walk or take a donkey or something, and it would take all day to climb out of this Valley of Nuns. It's called Valley of Nuns because the nuns were put there because they didn't want the nuns to be in danger from passing sailors. So the nuns were in this valley, and there are people who lived in this valley and other valleys on the island who literally have not seen the ocean, had not seen the ocean once in their lives. And it's a small island like a Hawaiian island, but it was such a trek. It would take at least a day to walk all the way up to the top. And then when you got to the top, you'd have to walk miles and miles and miles to go and see the ocean. So there were people who literally lived all their lives and never saw the ocean. They lived in this, and then the next picture will see, I'm actually taking these pictures from a viewing platform at the top of the hill where they would have had to walk. So imagine if you lived down there and you wanted to go out of your Valley of the Nuns, you had to walk to where I am to get over the mountains to go anywhere else. And then once you're up there, and that's again, that just shows you that valley is surrounded by mountains like that. It's just a valley surrounded by mountains. So can you imagine living in there and saying, oh, I want to go and spend the day by the sea, and you don't have cars, you can't drive, you have to climb or take a donkey. And then when you get to the top, you've got another day to get back, but you've also got probably a day or two to get to the ocean from there. So it's a really fascinating concept. Now they have a tunnel going in there, and it's fascinating to go and see. And this is another view of this stunningly beautiful island. This is actually from a restaurant. The views all around the island are just like this. It's just magnificent. And I think the last picture is actually about food and wine pairing, and it's a really fun story. That's Julia Child. I think you all know the name Julia Child. She is a great chef in America. Sadly, she's no longer with us. But I was doing a tasting with her at the Food and Wine Classic in Aspen. That wasn't there. That was a different occasion. But at the Food and Wine Classic in Aspen, I was doing a Madeira tasting. I had her, and I had Robert Parker, who's a wine writer, and then a couple of Canadian guys on my panel. So we were doing a Madeira tasting, and it was at the Little Nell Hotel in Aspen during Food and Wine Classic. And right before the tasting, she came up to me and said, Bartholomew, we've got to have bananas. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, we've got to have bananas because the best food and wine pairing in the world are bananas and Madeira. And I said, okay. So I ran to the manager of the Little Nell and said, hey, we've got to have bananas. Julia Child wants bananas. So I think he actually went to a shop to buy some bananas, and then they sliced them up and they all put them on a little dish in front of everyone, and we proceeded with our Madeira tasting. And right at the end of the tasting, someone put up their hand and said, excuse me, can I ask a question? I said, sure. And he said, can you tell us why we have bananas in front of us? And I turned to Julia and I said, Julia, can you please explain why you wanted them to have bananas? And she turned to me and said, oh dear, I can't remember. Which is, if you know her voice, that's what she sounds like. And it was just a classic moment. And it made me be able to have a story for life about Julia Child, which I'm very grateful to her for. What else? I think, wow, we've gone through this much quicker than our previous episodes because only one person chatting. You'll probably all sound asleep by now, but not having any guests made this go a little bit quicker than I expected, which is good. Now, next week, we have a really interesting Wine Wednesdays episode. We have Laura Rees. That's Laura Rees right there. She's lovely. She's just the most charming person you'll ever listen to. She is a master sommelier, a real master sommelier, which was a very, very, very tough exam to pass. And she is going to come and talk to us about English sparkling wine, specifically Gusbourne, which is a top English sparkling wine. And Gusbourne, I just love that wine. I hope you'll buy a bottle to drink whilst we're listening to her next week. And then we're doing two products next week. We're going to have Highclere Gin. We're going to have the 7th Earl of Carnarvon come on and talk to us about his Highclere Gin, which is a lovely gin. I had it recently. They sent me a bottle and it's delicious. But now I'm going to, before we show you the video that I promised, which is a beautiful video of Maduro, before we do that, I'm going to go to some questions, if you have time. So Maria from New Bedford in the United States said, I love those wines. I was born in Porto and own property on Madeira on the island. Well, that's not really a question, but it's a lucky you owning property on the island of Madeira. I think you're very lucky. And then this is from Janice in the United States. Are these red wines, do they resemble tastes of Merlot wines? Well, no, you've discovered they aren't. The Vino Verde is not Merlot and neither is Madeira. But if you want a Merlot style wine, the wine I make, something like this is what I would recommend. And you would have to look for the Broadbent Red on winesearch.com. Next one, John from United Kingdom says, a big vote of thanks for the Viking for putting together such a varied selection of visits whilst cruising in Madeira, as well as seeing established port merchants. We were treated to sample great table wines and discover the amazing muscatels from Favalos, a new area for me. We opted for the extension to Santiago, but sadly this did not include Vino Verde stop off. Perhaps you can arrange it as an additional stop. We did our own thing to Minho. Great show, good to have you back. Must revisit Madeira and those wonderful old warehouses in Villanova de Gaia. Yeah, you should. Jennifer, I don't know where Jennifer's from. She doesn't say. Can you please suggest which port in Madeira would pair best with classic flavors of Thanksgiving dessert, pumpkin, sweet potato, apple pies, puddings, thanks, and is there a traditional toast for sharing port in Madeira? Well, what I would do for those desserts, I would go and buy the 10-year-old Tawny port, preferably mine, Broadbent, or any 10-year-old Tawny port is good. As for a traditional toast for sharing port in Madeira, just enjoy drinking them together. Something I didn't tell you about Madeira is because it's cooked, it's practically indestructible. I used to tell people it doesn't matter how you store your wine. Once you've opened a bottle of Madeira, you can keep it open for ever. It doesn't go off. It's keep it for years open. Port's a little bit less. You need to drink those within a few months. But Madeira, you can open a bottle and 5 years later go back to it. And you can't really harm Madeira. And in fact, I used to say you can even keep it in the boot of your car, the trunk of your car, all summer long, and it won't go off. In fact, I tested that theory a couple of years ago. I got a bottle of 10-year-old Malmsey Madeira. I took a glass out and drank that, and then put the stopper back and put it in the boot of my car in early April. And I live in Richmond, Virginia, which is very hot and humid, and I just left it there. Now, I completely forgot about it, and in August I was having a dinner party, and I ran out of Madeira. Well, I didn't really run out. I just didn't want to open the very, very best stuff for the people who were there. So I ran out to my car, remembering that I had some Madeira in the car, and I brought it in. I poured it for everyone. I poured a little glass, and the trouble is it was too warm because it was from the trunk of a car. So I put ice cubes in it, and everyone was fine with that. It was delicious. Hadn't gone off all that time. Next, here's Eileen from Bloomfield Hills. My son's wife's family is from Lisbon. He is in love with tawny port. What is the best of a tawny port? Well, I would obviously, my Broadbent tawny port is the best, but I think also probably the company that's best known for tawny ports is Ferrera. That's Ferreira. And the gentleman who makes the Ferrera port also makes my port. So you're in good hands with either of those ones. Next, I look forward to, this is from Dean in Tiverton, United States. I look forward to, this is Dean Medeiros, I quoted him earlier. I look forward to you giving credence to the notion that any time not spent drinking port is time wasted. Yes, I say that all the time. Linda from Roanoke, and Dean, by the way, is moving to Portugal. He loves it so much. I know this guy, Dean Medeiros. He's moving to Portugal. Lynn at Roanoke, what do you think of American Madeiras? Well, there is no such thing because port and Madeira has to come from Portugal. I spoke earlier about domestically produced Madeira, but they have no bearing on Madeira at all. They don't go through the cooking process. They don't have the acidity. They don't have the, there's nothing about Madeira that can be compared to the true Madeira. So what do you think about Madeira, American Madeiras? Well, to be honest, if they didn't exist, there wouldn't be enough Madeira in the world because we don't produce enough on the island. And all those people who use Madeira to cook with, they buy the cheap domestic stuff. And though I don't think you should, they do. And so it serves a purpose, I guess. Poonam is a wonderful name from the United States. Your first one from Germany was a class act. Well, thank you so much, Poonam. That's really nice of you to say. I hope you guys all go back and watch these episodes if you haven't watched the first one from Germany with Konstantin Guntram. I agree, Poonam. It was great. That was really fun. Jenna from the United States. Do not apologize. I am thrilled. It is just wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for doing this for us. Why am I apologizing? Oh, maybe I apologize that it's just me today and no guests. Thank you, Jennifer. You're sweet. Katie from Parkland, United States. Thank you, Bartholomew. Thank you so much for all your knowledge and wonderful interviews. Well, thank you. Although I wasn't interviewing anyone today, I hope you won't change your mind. Jeffrey from Woodbury. If you hadn't got into your now profession, what job path do you think you would have gone down? Well, you see, I'm in the wine business because I really didn't have the imagination to know what else I should do. And to be honest, I think Hugh Grant stole the role that I should have had. That should have been my role in life. When he came out in 4 Weddings and a Funeral, and actually a bunch of my friends were in that as extras, even. And had I still been in England, I would have probably been in that movie, and I would have said to him, he can't have that job, it should be mine, but too bad. So acting, or maybe a politician of some sorts. Yeah, we need better politicians. Louis Finksburg, United States. My wife and I very much enjoyed a Viking cruise on Madeira River last year. Your pictures are bringing back wonderful memories of it, that trip. Oh, that's fantastic. Well, wait till you see the video we're going to show in a minute. You're going to just think you've died and gone to heaven. James from Portland, United States. What is the significance of the 8th note of a cuff on your label? What? Are you talking about? Oh, I see what you're talking about. This is on the back of every bottle of ours. It's our logo, but it's actually a family crest. It's the top of my family crest. My father ran for a political office in England. I think it was a sheriff of London, which is not a policing job. Sheriff is a title that you get in the city of London, the square mile. And when you run for political office in London, for the city of London, you have to have your own coat of arms. So he had to create a family coat of arms, which now I get to inherit and I can use. It's protected by trademark by it's an official heraldry coat of arms in England who protect it. So he designed it based on his interest. So he was a wine auctioneer. So here's the gavel, and the other end of it is a corkscrew. It's in his hand. The top of this is the bottle top, and in it, you very cleverly, you can't see it very well on this, but it is a single musical note, because my father was a great pianist. He loved his piano. Every night going to sleep at night, when I was a child, I used to listen to him playing Chopin, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, even Joplin, even Gottschalk. He liked the American ragtime music, and he liked the great classical composers, and it was wonderful. I actually have his grand piano now here in my office. I'm actually in my office right now. And then this sits on a crest. He's got the Yorkshire rose underneath. So this crown sits on 3 barrels, and inside the barrels are little squiggly things, which I accuse him of looking like sperm, but he didn't deny that or confirm that. So one day I'd love to show you the entire family crest, which is great fun, but this is our logo. Anyway, that was a long answer to your question. Gosh, a lot of questions coming up. Here we go. How long is too long for port to age? If we ever see a bottle of 50-year-old, 100-year-old port, should we be intrigued and taste it, or should we run far, far away? This is from Grant. Grant, I don't know where you're from. It doesn't say, but well, if that were about Madeira, I would say, taste it, drink it, enjoy it. It's going to be great. Madeira is indestructible. If it's a port, a 50-year-old port, 50 years old is not hugely old for port. In fact, it's not very old at all. So I would say drink it. The advantage of port is vintage port is that it is in very dark bottles, so it keeps the light out. So it is preserved from ultra, sunshine. So it's not going to be damaged by light. But if it's 100 years old, I would then sort of question, well, how has this been stored? Because a 100-year-old port, it's getting up there in age, and if it's been in a cellar, proper cellar, I would not worry about it at all. Of course, I'm talking about vintage ports, tawny ports, different. Vintage port is designed to age in the bottle. A tawny port has already aged in a barrel, so you're meant to drink a tawny port. Don't age tawny ports. Opal from Melbourne, Florida. Does your wife also share your passion for wines? Thank you, Bartholomew, for another informative and fascinating talk. Well, funny enough, I think my wife married me because of Madeira. I think she fell in love with Madeira long before she had any interest in me, because she came to dinner and I cooked leg of lamb for her and gave her some Madeira, and the Madeira was what she talked about. And she started talking about leg of lamb because every single dinner party I did leg of lamb, and I think that became a talking point. But the Madeira, she loves that. She likes drinking wine. She's not academically interested in wine, but she likes wine, yes, of course. Gaetano from Windsor, where can I purchase your wines in the UK? I'm really struggling to find them online, especially the Madeira. Well, we have a problem. We don't have we have the Vino Verde. The Vino Verde you can buy online in England. Right now, we are between importers for the ports and Madeiras. So we're trying to sort that out. If you send me an email at bbroadbent@broadbent.com, or go to my website, broadbent.com, send me an info, or go to my Facebook, Bartholomew Broadbent, send me a message so I can tag it, so that when we get a importer there, I can let you know. But right now, I'm sorry that Windsor in England is a bit suffering from not having our Madeira. Right, next, Milt from Williamsburg in the United States. Are you familiar with Croft Distinction Port? Yes, I am. I've had it many times, as I've had many, many ports. And yeah, Croft's a good port producer. Most port producers are good, so most ports are good. Sharon from Palm City, United States. What is the difference between Madeira, made on Madeira Island, and the Madeira commonly sold in small liquor stores called Taylor, made in New York? Well, basically, Taylor Madeira, made in New York, is made by a massive company. It's a huge wine that's mostly used for cooking, but the trouble is, we've already talked about this. If you use Madeira for cooking, you burn off the flavors, so you have to use a true Madeira, which has already been cooked, and so when you cook it again, you keep that flavor. But a domestic Madeira doesn't work for me. The difference is the proper process of making Madeira is to heat it. Here's from Peter from Winston-Salem. He says, does Burns Steakhouse, Tampa, Florida, still warehouse a large collection of Madeira or Tinto Verde? Do they still have the old Madeiras? Did you ever meet the father and son there? Yes. Byrne was a great friend of my father's, and inside the Harry War Room, which is a dessert room in Burns Steakhouse, which there is a picture of my father on the wall in Burns Steakhouse. So I knew Byrne and his son. I know his son still, Byrne sadly passed away, but it still has the biggest wine list in the world for a restaurant, I believe. And yes, they still have great Madeiras and great wines. It's a mecca for wine people. One of my employees, Greg Perkins, just spent his 60th birthday at Burns because they have this massive list, and you can always find great wines that no one sort of notices, and they have this policy of not marking wines up, so you can get really great wines for inexpensive prices. Temperature to serve Madeira. This is from Kathy in Denver. Thank you, Kathy. I serve all my Madeiras at room temperature, but you can chill them, and Cercial especially is good chilled. Even though I say Cercial is a dry Madeira, it's still about 40 or 50 grams per sugar, so it's not totally bone dry, but it's so it can be drunk as a as a dessert wine as well, but it's really better before dinner. But yeah, temperature-wise, I serve it at room temperature personally. And then we have Greg from Asheville. Greg from Asheville, who sent us a picture, I assume, earlier, unless it's a different Greg. Loved today's segment. It was great to learn from your experiences and see the joy you derive from your lifetime of study of wines. Well, thanks, Greg. That's I did enjoy that. Kathleen from Tucson in the United States. What do you think about the Setubal Muscatel? Ooh, Kathleen, if you ever came to Richmond, Virginia and wanted to taste a great old Setubal, I have probably about 40 different vintages open at my house right now. Josimir Fonseca, in about 1997, sent me 3 bottles each of Setubals going back to 1884. And they asked me to host a once-in-a-lifetime tasting for the press in New York. And I managed to pour all the rum out of 1 bottle so that I had 2 bottles left. And I've been living off, they've been open literally since then, and they are still fantastic. They're kind of like Madeira, they don't go off. They come from a peninsula just outside of Lisbon, and unfortunately the town of Lisbon has basically grown around this peninsula and eaten up most of the vineyard land, so there's very little Setubal produced anymore from the Muscatel grape, but it's a great wine. I love that question. When I have people who've never had it, I love showing them. If I have a dinner party, I love to bring out a little sip of this Setubal from one of the vintages. With 40 or 50 bottles, they're just sitting there. It's going to take me years to go through them because I give it like a thimbleful to anyone who wants to taste it. But Nora in the US, how widely available are your wines in the US? Well, basically, how widely most of my wines are available throughout the US. And in fact, my import company reps over 30 different wineries. So we have some wines which we import, which are available throughout the United States, in every state. I think even in North Dakota, we're selling some wine. But basically, you should be able to go to winesearcher.com and find our wines anywhere. If you really want to find a wine in your state, just send me an email through info@broadbent.com. At my website, go to the info, send me a question. I'll let you know where you can find it in your state. Carla from San Francisco. This must be Carla Schleminger. Carla's a great friend in San Francisco. Hi Bolu, so she knows my nickname. To pair with a chocolate dessert, port has been a classic pairing. If you have Madeira on hand, is that preferred and which style? If port, still tawny port, what should ruby port be paired with? Thank you. Well, actually, Carla, I think vintage port is better with chocolate, personally. I used to say tawny port, but if I'm having chocolate, I'm going to have a vintage port. Madeira can go with port, but there are 2 things. Can go with dessert, but with chocolate dessert, but really young vintage port is what I put with chocolate dessert. The other thing I put vintage port with over Madeira is something like Stilton cheese. And Carla, good to hear from you. Carla lives in this beautiful building where one year I went to the rooftop of her house and they had covered the Fillmore Street with snow, and we watched people ski jumping off the hills of San Francisco. It was a spectacular, memorable day. Linda from Boulder. Linda from Boulder in the United States. Bartholomew, kind sir, you sure you're talking to me? A wonderful way for us to spend our noon hour here in Boulder, Colorado. Randy and Linda, thank you, Randy and Linda, that's nice of you to say. Peter from Winston-Salem, what is the alcohol percent in your Madeira and Vinho Verde wines? Well, Vinho Verde is 9%, and the Madeiras are 18% or 19%, and the ports are 19%. Linda again from Boulder, Colorado. We bought and enjoyed both of your Broadbent rainwater and your Vinho Verde together with a flower label story from your niece, and we will try frozen banana with Madeira poured over it. Randy and Linda, thanks. That's great fun. Bob from Huntington Woods, United States. Do you believe that the wines you mentioned could cure coronavirus? Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice? We need a cure. I'm not going to suggest that anything cures coronavirus, but I think it'd make you very happy if you drink a lot of the wines. And this is from Louis from Finksburg. Louis asks, how should you store a Madeira after opening it? I was told to store port in the refrigerator after opening it. You know, I don't think port needs to go in the refrigerator. It depends how long you're going to keep it. If you're a tawny port can be kept open for months. A vintage port can be kept open for weeks. And Madeira can be kept open forever. You don't need to refrigerate Madeira. You don't need to use any contraption to pull out the air. Madeira is already totally oxidized. So I think basically you don't need to really worry about how you're going to store your Madeiras at all. Ports, the white port, I do keep that in the fridge, but you don't need to. But yeah, I think we're at the end of the questions. It's very funny that people like Carla Shermingo are watching. Thank you so much. I think all it leaves me to thank James Prismal, who is behind the scenes bringing up the pictures when we need them. And in a minute, he's going to show you this wonderful video from Porto. Claire Armitage, who puts these together with me and James, and then also Heather Donoghue, who is also an organizer. Between you three, you've done another great job. Thank you so much. James, if you think there are any other questions I haven't answered, please let me know. But otherwise, I'm going to say farewell to all of you, and please enjoy this video of the Portugal's River of Gold itinerary. This is actually the Viking cruise itinerary. So, and also, please send us pictures of yourselves drinking these wines. The address on the screen right now is the Viking.TV submissions. You can send pictures of yourselves there drinking these wines, and we love seeing them. So thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for all your questions, for watching this, and for spending so much time with me today. I hope you had nothing better to do. And I'll see you next week with Gusbourne and Highclere Gin. Thank you.
This relaxing 10-day itinerary is an ideal way to experience the best of Portugal. Your journey begins with 2 overnights in remarkable Lisbon and its treasure trove of 18th century architecture. Then it's on to Porto, perched at the mouth of the Douro River. Explore the quaint streets and perhaps take in a local fado performance. The next day meander at Villarreal and Matus Palace and Gardens in Regua, before sailing through valleys blanketed with vineyards to pause at Quinta do Sejo for wine tasting. Cross the Spanish border to enjoy a full day of exploration in Salamanca, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Portugal's Pinhao brings wine tasting and lunch at Quinta da Avasada. Then sail the sun-kissed Douro Valley before calling at Lamiego, home to the Sanctuary of Our Lady and its Baroque staircase, a distinctive UNESCO site. Your relaxing Viking voyage concludes in Porto, where you'll enjoy 2 overnights, so you'll have plenty of time to further explore this enchanting city.
Now, doesn't that make you want to go on a cruise? And we did have one more comment from Mika in Montclair, who was so in love with the 2 Austrian guys. And she's just asked me, do you sell your hat? No, but you can buy these hats on the island of Madeira. They're very traditional, they're funny little things, but they're great fun. And that's it. No, Mika, I don't sell it, but it's not a bad idea. I know we should get some hats like this. All right, thank you again, and see you next week. Bye.